Today we're looking at all created equal. The government uh, said that 4 million Americans were now freed from slavery, but this does not mean that the battle is now won. Just because you say you're free doesn't mean that it makes it so, even if the government says so, because things can happen where people can take those rights away on a small scale. And so the former Confederate states were allowed to send their representatives back to Congress. They started reforming their states. This is part of the Reconstruction process where they're coming back into the Union. Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, all these states that went off into the Confederacy are now being re-entered back into the American Congress. And this poses a problem because if they continue to vote like they did before the war, then it's going to be hard to change the laws and make amendments to make sure that African Americans have the rights that the Civil War was fought over. So President Johnson made those states ratify the 13th Amendment, which bans slavery. The result, terrible violence erupted in some southern states as angry whites attacked and killed innocent African Americans. This was a big problem in the South. They started passing black codes because now they're back in Congress. They're in their state governments. They're making laws to make things as difficult as possible for African Americans to function as normal citizens. One other thing that the government needed to do was to get rid of the Dred Scott decision. If you remember in U.S. 1, Dred Scott, a Virginia-born slave, his owner would take him to the North and the West, that's free territory. And Dred Scott said, "Hey, I'm in free soil. I should be free." And the Supreme Court said, "Nope, you're not a citizen. You have no standing. We can't even listen to what you're doing." You see this again and again. Whenever the Supreme Court is in the wrong, I always hear standing. They did that to the Cherokee Indians right before the Trail of Tears. We see it today happening. And so this was a really bad decision, one that you just have to wonder how they could have come to this. But basically the problem was they said that African Americans could not be citizens. They don't have any rights. They don't have any standing in court. They can't vote, all that stuff. So now what do you do? How do you get around the Supreme Court and their decisions? You can't make a law because then they could say it's unconstitutional. Well, the only way that you can make sure that something is constitutional is by putting it into the Constitution. So what they try to do is, before I get to the Constitution, the voting is the real problem. If African Americans can vote, then they can vote for people that are going to put in a change to protect their rights. If they can't vote, then people are going to get into office and into power that are not going to protect their rights. And so white Southerners knew this, and you can see by this depiction here in this cartoon, they would show up with guns. They would deny black people their vote. There is a movie that I highly recommend that depicts this very, very well. Let's see. It's called Free State of Jones with Matthew McConaughey. And it's about a Confederate Army deserter who goes back to Mississippi. And this is based on a true story. They go back there and they start fighting in support of the Union to try to get out of what's going on there, because they don't believe in what has become the Confederate cause, which is basically to hold on to their slaves. And so there's a scene in The Free State of Jones where Matthew McConaughey's character and all of his friends and African Americans are all going together to vote, and you could see here they wanted to submit a Republican ticket because you had Democrat tickets, let's say they were red, and the Republican ticket was blue, and you could see which one you're going to put in, and so you had to take one of these tickets and put it into the bowl, and then they knew how many each person got. And so they would say things like, "Oh, well, we ran out of Republican tickets. You can't have any." And, So Matthew McConaughey and the African Americans said, well, we'll wait till you make some more. And they're like, it could take some time. And they're like, we'll wait. And so they finally got the tickets and they put them in there, and the whole town voted, and there's like 50 African Americans or 30, whatever it is. And so they did the total tally of the town vote, and the Democrat won something like 30-2. Obviously, there was not 2 votes for the Republicans. They cheated on the voting. And so they would do all these things to rig the voting. And this is something that happens anytime you have democracy. You're going to have people that try to cheat, stuff the ballot box, whatever. And so election integrity is very important. You have to have power, and you don't have that power unless you have the right to vote. So we needed to amend the Constitution, make sure that the Supreme Court doesn't step in and do something we don't want them to do. So amendment, our vocabulary word for today, a change or addition to the U.S. Constitution. And so they put in 3 amendments in the next couple of years. We've got the 13th Amendment, and definitely have this in your notes. The 13th Amendment is the banning of slavery. The Supreme Court can't say that it's okay to. Congress can't say that it's okay to have slaves. Nobody can say. It's in the Constitution, and that's the whole key. Is that the Supreme Court can say something is unconstitutional, but they can't say the Constitution is unconstitutional. So when you make an amendment, it's part of the Constitution, and the Supreme Court is powerless to change whatever's in the Constitution. So once they say 13th Amendment, no more slavery, then it's the law of the land. Nobody can touch it. And then they went further by saying, well, the Dred Scott, they said that, African Americans aren't citizens. So they might be free, they may not be slaves, but how are they supposed to function in American society if they're not citizens? And so the 14th Amendment said that anybody born in the United States, including African Americans, are guaranteed equal protection under the law. They are citizens. Now, this is abused, for the past 50 years. But the 14th Amendment was designed to help African Americans, to newly freed slaves, make them citizens, that they have the same protection under the law. You can't treat them any differently than anybody else. Of course, this is going to be tested in the next 100 years. But Tennessee was the only southern state that ratified it. Everybody else in the South chose to go against it. And of course, all the northern and western states supported it, so it went through. And so all these African Americans now are citizens, and what goes along with citizenship? Voting. Well, they still tried to make laws, the black codes and all these things that go on in the South to try to prevent African Americans from voting. So then we go to the 15th Amendment. And the 15th Amendment said that African Americans have the right to vote. All male citizens, regardless of their race, right here. All male citizens could vote regardless of their race, even if they have been slaves. And so again, once it's in the Constitution, it's the law of the land. You can't go against it. Now, they'll try to find different ways. For instance, they'll put in these poll taxes, like you got to pay $100 in order to vote. And of course, they wouldn't collect it from the white Southerners, but they would from the blacks. And a lot of them couldn't afford it, so guess what? They weren't allowed to vote. Or they would give them a quote-unquote intelligence test where, a white person comes in and is like, oh, what color is the sky? Blue. Okay. Black person comes in, what's this algebraic equation? What's the answer to that? And, they don't know, or, some very difficult, impossible question. Like, oh, okay, well, you failed, so you can't vote. And so they would try doing all these things to try to prevent African Americans from voting, in addition to rigging the elections and stuffing the ballot boxes and so forth. So, there's the struggle is long from over, but the government at least is doing its job by making these amendments so that it is very clear that you cannot get around this voting. And you remember the 3/5 compromise? Well, now that's gone, because the 3/5 was about slavery. It wasn't about black people. We talked about this in US 1, that slaves were counted as 3/5 of a person. Well, now that they're no longer counted as 3/5, they're a whole person. That means that the southern states are going to have more people. Their population is going to be bigger now because they can count them as whole people, and so they're going to get more representatives in the House of Representatives. And so, as a condition of that, they said the federal government said, if you don't let black people vote, then you can't have representation in Congress. You're going against the whole thing. If you're going from 3/5 to a person because there's no more slavery now, then those former slaves have to have the right to vote. And so unless black men can vote, the number of congressmen of their state would be reduced, because then you can't count people that you're not allowing to vote. So that's where we're going to leave it today. Just make sure that you know the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. These are the Civil War amendments. 13th Amendment means no more slavery, no involuntary servitude, except for a punishment for a crime where the party shall have been duly convicted. And so, in order to make sure that you have equal protection under the law, you have the 14th Amendment. No state shall deprive any person life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, and also made African Americans citizens with that protection. And then the 15th Amendment is that the right of citizens of the United States, that, remember, they were made citizens in the 14th Amendment, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So it doesn't matter if you used to be a slave, you now have the right to vote.